July 19th, 1945, 0700 hours. Commander Eugene Flucky presses his eye against the chilled rubber of the periscope. Through the crosshairs, he watches a Japanese supply train snake along the Karafuto coastline like a dark iron serpent. It is loaded with the very steel and soldiers meant to bleed the American invasion forces. The commander is a legend. At 31 years old, Eugene "Lucky" Flucky has already sent 17 enemy ships to the dark abyss of the Pacific. He is the heart of the USS Barb, a Gaka-class submarine displacing 2,400 tons of lethal American engineering. But today, the man with the Medal of Honor isn't hunting ships. A target of opportunity. Flucky has been observing the Kashiho region for days, tracking the rhythmic pulse of the Japanese rail system. 6 trains a day move along these tracks, carrying up to 60 troops each, plus crates of ammunition. The tracks are vulnerable, sitting just 400 yards from the salt spray of the ocean. The USS Barb is a predator. She is one of the most decorated vessels in the fleet, boasting for Presidential Unit citations and 8 battle stars. Yet her most dangerous asset is the sheer audacity of her captain and the brilliance of her 80-man crew. They are tired from 3 weeks in the Sea of Okhotsk, but they sense something historic, a shift in the war. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese merchant marine has been decimated by the silent service. Submarines are literally running out of targets as the enemy shipping lanes go bone dry. It's Flucky, never one to sit idle, realizes that if the enemy won't come to the sea, the Barb must go to the land. The rocket innovation. Before this final patrol, Flucky approached Navy R&D with a request that sounded like madness to the brass. He wanted to bolt a Mark 51 rocket launcher onto the Barb's forward deck to shell shore targets. It was an improvised experiment that turned the Barb into the world's first ballistic missile submarine, a trial by fire. On June 22nd, Flucky put his new toy to the test against the industrial center of Shari. 12 rockets screamed through the midnight air in just 5 seconds, turning a military factory into a towering inferno. It was the first time a submarine had ever conducted a shore bombardment with rockets. A 3-week reign of terror, the Barb spent the following weeks haunting the coast, firing 60 more rockets at paper mills and shipyards. Flucky even used the French deck gun to personally duel with military installations. The Japanese were baffled, unable to catch the ghost ship that struck from the darkness and vanished. The railroad dilemma. Despite the success of the rockets, the trains remained a thorn in Flucky's side. Rockets were too imprecise for a moving locomotive, and deck guns only caused temporary damage to the rails. The Japanese could repair a broken track in hours. Flucky wanted something that would stay broken. The impossible idea. Flucky gathered his brightest minds in the cramped, humid quarters of the sub. He wanted to destroy a moving train from the ground, a feat never attempted by a submarine crew. He knew torpedoes were useless against land targets, and he needed a way to strike with surgical, devastating precision. The Torpedo Room Council. Inside the forward torpedo room, Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders and Billy Hatfield stared at a 55-pound scuttling charge. This massive explosive was designed to destroy the Barb itself to prevent capture. Now they were brainstorming how to use it to vaporize a Japanese engine. A childhood memory. Billy Hatfield, an electrician's mate who worked for the railroad before the war, had a sudden flash of inspiration. He remembered placing walnuts on tracks as a boy to watch the heavy wheels crack them open. He proposed building a pressure-sensitive switch that used the train's own weight to kill it. Engineering the pickle jar. The men salvaged a micro-switch from Submarine, spare parts, and wired it to 3 dry cell batteries. To protect the delicate electronics from the salt air and damp soil, they packed the entire assembly into an empty glass pickle jar. It was a masterpiece of MacGyver engineering born in the belly of a sub. The weight of the metal, Hatfield calculated that a Japanese locomotive weighed roughly 60 to 80 tons. This massive pressure would depress the steel rails at least a quarter of an inch. That tiny movement was all the microswitch needed to complete the circuit and ignite the 1.H 55-pound charge directly under the boiler. Calculating the risk, Flucky studied the blueprints of the device with a grim, focused intensity. The engineering was sound, but the operational risks were staggering for a submarine in shallow water. They would have to surface within 1,000 yards of the shore, making them a sitting duck for any patrol. The shore party window. Flucky estimated the shore party would need exactly 90 minutes to row to the beach, plant the bomb, and return. Any longer and the dawn would betray them to the Japanese garrisons. The USS Barb would be operating in just 36 feet of water, barely enough to submerge. A call for volunteers. When Flucky asked for volunteers for the most dangerous mission of the war, all 80 men raised their hands. Had to be selective, choosing only those whose skills and survival chances were highest. He looked for a specific set of qualities that would ensure the mission's success. The commander's criteria. Flucky's first rule was heartbreaking. Only unmarried men were allowed to go. He refused to be the reason a woman back home became a widow. He then looked for physical fitness, strong swimmers, and most importantly, men who had been Boy Scouts in their youth. The Scout philosophy. Flucky believed the Boy Scouts' training in navigation, knots, and emergency procedures would be vital in the pitch-black chaos of a raid. He needed men who wouldn't panic if they got separated on hostile soil. In the end, 8 men were chosen for the history books. The squad leaders, Chief Paul Saunders, a veteran of every single Barb patrol, would lead the party. Lieutenant William Walker was assigned as the officer in charge. They were joined by the technical genius Billy Hatfield and 5 other sailors who possessed the grit and muscle needed for the job. Improvising the tools. The crew realized they didn't have any shovels or picks for digging on land. The engineers went to work, cutting steel plates from the engine rooms, lower flats, and welding them into crude tools. They were preparing for a ground war with the heart of a submarine crew, the stakes of survival. Knowing the Japanese used guard dogs to patrol the tracks, the men packed raw steaks to toss as distractions. They also packed survival gear for a 130-mile trek to Soviet territory in case they were stranded. They knew the Geneva Convention would not protect them if they were caught. The Weather Watch. For 4 days the Barb patrolled the coast, but the skies remained cruelly clear. The moon was a spotlight that would illuminate the sub and the rafts for any Japanese sentry. Flucky grew frustrated as their patrol window began to close. They had only 5 days left. The clouds arrive. On the evening of July 22nd, thick cirrus clouds began to build on the horizon. By sunset, a heavy, dark blanket of stratus clouds capped the mountain peaks of Karafuto. Flucky saw his opening and gave the order that would change naval history forever. Final checks. The 8 men assembled on the deck in the middle of the night, their faces darkened with soot. They checked their waterproof flashlights, their pistols, and the precious pickle jar. They wore Mae West life vests, knowing a single slip into the freezing surf could be fatal. The stealth approach. The Barb crept toward the coastline at 2,300 hours, running silent on her electric motors to avoid detection. The dark hull was a shadow among shadows, barely visible against the black water. Flucky watched the shoreline through the periscope, searching for any sign of life or movement. The danger zone. The depth gauge clicked down. 40 feet, 38 feet, then a heart-stopping 36 feet. The Barb's keel was nearly scraping the bottom of the ocean floor. If a patrol boat appeared now, the sub could not dive. She would have to fight it out on the surface, launch the rafts, At 00:05 hours on July 23rd, the order was whispered across the deck. 2 black rubber rafts were lowered over the side into the gentle swell. The 8 men climbed in, their oars dipping into the water with practiced, rhythmic silence as they pushed away from the sub. The dark paddle. The rafts moved through the 950 yards of water like ghosts, the men breathing in the salt and the tension. Behind them, the USS Barb disappeared into the darkness, a silent guardian waiting in the shallows. Ahead lay the sovereign territory of the Japanese Empire. Landing on Karafuto, the rafts grounded on the cold sand at 00:30 hours. All 8 men leaped out, dragging the boats above the high tide line to hide them behind jagged rocks. 2 men, Newland and Richard, stayed behind to guard the escape route and keep a vigil for patrol boats. The first steps. The remaining 6 men began the 400-yard trek inland, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They were the first American combat troops to ever set foot on this part of the Japanese home islands. Every rustle of the high grass sounded like an approaching enemy. The drainage ditch. They encountered a deep drainage ditch filled with stagnant, muddy water. The men lowered themselves in, the cold muck soaking through their clothes and making their gear heavy. They scrambled up the opposite bank, dripping wet but focused on the dark ridge of the tracks. The road crossing. Packed earth road ran parallel to the tracks, a major artery for Japanese military vehicles. Men crouched in the tall weeds, listening for the sound of engines or voices. Finding none, they crossed one by one, shadows flitting across the dirt like predatory birds. The tracks appear. They finally reached the base of the railroad embankment, a raised ridge of gravel and steel. Walker and Saunders crawled to the top, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. The rails stretched out into the infinity of the north and south, cold and indifferent. A close call. Just as they prepared to move, a faint vibration hummed through the steel rails. Sever signaled a frantic halt as a distant chugging sound grew into a roar. A train was coming from the north, its engine a massive dark silhouette in the blackout conditions. The ghost train. The locomotive thundered past just 15 feet from where the Americans lay flat in the dirt. The heat from the boiler and the smell of coal smoke washed over them. They counted 16 cars, their wheels clattering with a rhythmic violence that shook the very earth. The signal to work. Saunders waited 2 full minutes after the train's taillights vanished before whistling the all clear. The men scrambled onto the gravel bed. Their improvised tools ready, they had to work fast. The encounter with the first train proved how active this line truly was. Choosing the kill zone, Hatfield selected a straight section of track where the train would be moving at maximum velocity. He knew that momentum would be their ally in the coming destruction. He knelt between the ties, his hands feeling for the perfect spot to bury the heart of the bomb. The hard dig, the gravel ballast came away easily, but the earth beneath was packed hard as concrete. The sailors took turns swinging the improvised picks, the sound of metal on stone echoing too loudly for comfort. Every few minutes they stopped to listen for the sound of boots on the gravel. The clock is ticking. They had been on the shore for 30 minutes, and the window was shrinking fast. Flucky's 90-minute limit was a hard line in the sand. Hatfield began to sweat despite the cold night air as he prepped the scuttling charge for its final resting place. The second train. At 01:15, a soft whistle from the Southern Sentry froze the team again. Another train was approaching, this time from the south heading north. The men dropped flat, Hatfield hugging the pickle jar to his chest as if it were a living thing. Blackout safety. Once again, the Japanese protocols for running without headlights saved the American shore party. The train roared past in total darkness, its crew oblivious to the saboteurs inches from their wheels. This second train confirmed that the railroad was a vital, high-traffic artery. The final excavation. As soon as the noise faded, Marcus attacked the hole with renewed desperation. They managed to clear a space 12 inches square and 8 inches deep directly under the western rail. It was the perfect nest for the 55-pound canister of high explosives. Setting the charge. Hatfield carefully lowered the scuttling charge into the hole, packing dirt around it to prevent it from shifting. He then placed the 3 dry cell batteries beside it, his fingers flying as he connected the wires to the microswitch that would trigger the end. The delicate connection. This was the most dangerous part of the mission. Hatfield had to position the switch so precisely that only the weight of a train would trip it. He worked by the dim, shielded light of a single flashlight, his breathing shallow and controlled as he wired the detonator. The circuit is live. At 0135, Hatfield looked up and gave a sharp nod to Saunders. The final wire was connected. The bomb was now hot. Any pressure on the rail above would result in an immediate catastrophic explosion. The team began to back away, smoothing the gravel as they went, camouflaging the death. They spent a few precious seconds ensuring the site looked undisturbed. To a casual observer, the tracks looked exactly as they had an hour ago. The men then turned and began their silent, high-speed retreat back toward the beach and the waiting rafts, the return journey. They retraced their steps across the road and through the muddy drainage ditch. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the heavy fatigue of their soaked clothes. They reached the beach at 0145, finding Newland and Richard exactly where they had left them, paddling for life. All 8 men pushed the rafts into the surf and began a desperate sprint back to the barb. They were halfway there when Flucky's voice boomed through a megaphone from the dark ocean. "Another train is coming. Paddle like your lives depend on it." The race against time. The men drove their oars into the water with a fury born of pure survival instinct. Behind them, they could hear the distant rhythmic chugging of a third locomotive. It was approaching from the north, heading straight for the trap they had just finished setting. The barb's peril. Flucky had moved the submarine even closer to the shore to shorten the row, but she was now in dangerously shallow water. He had the engines idling, ready to bolt. If the explosion happened while the men were still in the water, the shock wave or the light could expose them all. The recovery. The raft slammed into the side of the barb at 0146. The men didn't use the ladders. They were pulled up by the deck crew like sacks of grain. The rubber rafts were sliced and abandoned to sink, as there was no time to bring them aboard before the sub had to move. Sealing the hatch, Saunders was the last man through the hatch. Flucky slammed it shut and ordered the barb to head for deep water at flank speed. The diesel engines roared to life, churning the shallow water into a frothing white wake as the submarine surged away from the coast. The impact. At 0147, the northbound train reached the kill zone. The lead wheels of the 68-ton locomotive pressed down on the western rail. The metal flexed just enough to close Hatfield's microswitch, completing the circuit and triggering 55 pounds of high explosive. The fireball. A massive, blinding explosion erupted from the embankment, visible from the barb's bridge even 700 yards away. The locomotive's boiler, filled with superheated steam, ruptured instantly, added the force of a second explosion, sending a pillar of fire hundreds of feet into the air. The disintegration. The locomotive was torn into 3 distinct sections of mangled steel. The drive wheels were sheared off the chassis, and the smokestack was launched into the air like a rocket. The heavy engine cartwheeled down the embankment, a flaming wreck of iron and steam, the pileup. The freight cars behind the engine had no time to brake. The first car slammed into the crater at 40 miles per hour and accordioned into a splintered mess. The second car climbed over the first, and the rest of the 16 cars jackknifed into a massive, burning heap of debris. Secondary blasts. As the wreckage settled, the ammunition inside the freight cars began to cook off. A series of smaller explosions rattled the air, sending tracers and sparks into the night sky. The primary supply line to the southern garrison had been severed in a single, violent moment. Topside witness. Flucky ordered all non-essential crew members to the deck to see the fruits of their labor. The sailors cheered as they watched the horizon glow orange with the funeral pyre of the Japanese train. It was a sight no other submariners in history would ever witness. The searchlights. The celebration was cut short as Japanese searchlights began to sweep the water from nearby coastal batteries. The enemy was searching for the source of the attack, their beams stabbing through the darkness. Flucky ordered the sub to change course and push for the 60-foot line. The emergency dive. As soon as the depth gauge hit 60 feet, the barb's bow tilted down. She slipped beneath the surface just as a searchlight beam passed over her previous position. The crew fell into a tense silence as they moved away from the coast, listening for the sound of patrol boats. 6 hours of silence. The barb stayed submerged until 0800, creeping through the deep water to put distance between themselves and the crime scene. When Flucky finally raised the periscope at dawn, he saw a thick column of black smoke still rising from the Carafudo coast. The final strikes. The war wasn't over for the barb yet. Over the next 72 hours, they continued their rampage, shelling a radio station and a shipyard. They fired their final 12 rockets at a garrison on Cayo Island, leaving a trail of destruction behind them as they headed for Midway. The heroes return. The USS Barb arrived at Midway on August 2, 1945. The crew stood on deck in their dress whites, but all eyes were on the submarine's battle flag. It was a tapestry of history, covered in patches for every ship sunk and every award earned by the lucky barb. The locomotive symbol. At the bottom of the flag, tucked under the symbols for carriers and destroyers, was a small, hand-sewn Japanese locomotive. It was the only submarine battle flag in the world to bear such a mark. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself came to Midway to salute the crew. The photograph. The 8 men of the shore party posed with the flag, looking like ordinary young men from the American heartland. Saunders, Hatfield, and the others would soon return to their farms and factories, but for one night they had been the most effective ground force in the Pacific. The end of the war. Only 6 days after the Barb reached Midway, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 9 days after that, Japan surrendered. The war ended before the Barb could ever go on her 13th patrol, making the train attack the perfect final act for her career. The official tally. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee confirmed the Barb's devastating record. She had sunk 17 vessels totaling nearly 100,000 tons. Her biggest kill was the escort carrier Anyo, which she sent to the bottom of the South China Sea in just 40 minutes. A lasting legacy. Beyond the tonnage, the Barb proved that submarines were the future of multi-domain warfare. Flucky's use of rockets and sabotage teams changed the silent service forever. He demonstrated that a sub could project power far inland, a concept that led to the modern missile sub. The lineage of power. Every modern Ohio-class submarine carrying nuclear missiles can trace its conceptual roots to the Mark 51 launcher on the Barb's deck. Flucky showed that the ocean was not a barrier, but a highway for delivering destruction to any target on Earth. The fate of the Barb. After the war, the Barb was decommissioned and eventually loaned to the Italian Navy. Renamed the Enrico Tazzoli, she served for 18 more years. In a tragic end for such a historic vessel, she was sold for scrap in 1972 for a mere $100,000. The flag remains. Although the sub was lost to the scrapyard, her legendary battle flag was saved. It now hangs behind glass at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut. It remains a silent witness to the night the Barb went hunting on dry land. Admiral Fluckey's career. Eugene Fluckey continued to serve with distinction, eventually becoming a Rear Admiral. He served as the Director of Naval Intelligence and commanded the entire Pacific Submarine Force. He retired in 1972 after 37 years of dedicated heroic service. The Portugal Orphanage. In a beautiful twist of fate, the man who was so skilled at war spent his retirement helping the innocent. He and his wife opened an orphanage in Portugal, caring for children for 8 years. Proved that a warrior's heart can also be a heart of gold. Thunder Below. In 1992, Fluckey published his memoirs, Thunder Below, which became a classic of naval literature. It remains required reading for midshipmen at the Naval Academy. The book ensured that the story of the Barb would never be forgotten by future generations of sailors. The greatest achievement. Fluckey died in 2007 at the age of 93, but he left behind a record more important than medals. He often told reporters that his proudest statistic was 0. That was the number of men who died under his command during the entire war, a command philosophy. Fluckey believed in calculated risk, not reckless gambling. He pushed the Barb to the very edge of her mechanical limits, but he never pushed his men beyond the point where their skill could save them. He was a leader who valued life above all else. The ordinary heroes, the members of the shore party, lived quiet, humble lives after the war. They rarely spoke of their night on Karafuto, considering it just another day's work. They were part of a generation that did extraordinary things and then asked for no credit in return. It's the only ones. To this day, the mission remains the only Allied ground combat operation on the Japanese home islands. Final tribute. If the story of the USS Barb and Admiral Fluckey moves you, remember to keep their memory alive. Hit that like button and subscribe to ensure these tales of heroism aren't lost to time. Thank you for watching the story of the submarine that sank a train.